welcome back to the Obby series. In today's episode, we're going to be implementing the reset button so that players can automatically make themselves respawn if they've missed a jump or if they want to restart from the previous checkpoint for any reason. Now, hopping directly into Studio, the first thing that we're going to do is begin by creating the GUI. And what I mean by the GUI is we actually have a reset button which is displayed on the player's screen. In the last episode, we actually created the left GUI to display the social button. And today, we'll actually be duplicating that, modifying the GUI a little bit so that we can display another button on the right-hand side of the screen, which will be the button that players can use to reset. So, in order to create this GUI, what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the Start GUI, and we're actually going to select the left GUI and then duplicate it. Then we'll go ahead and rename this one to be called Right. Then, going inside of the Screen GUI, we have the frame. We'll go ahead and reposition this. So, on the anchor point, we want to set the X to 1. And then on the position on the X scale, we want to set that to 1 as well. Now, our X offset is also set to 10. And what we want to do is we want to actually set that to -10 in order to subtract 10 pixels from the right-hand side of the screen so that it's 10 pixels away, just like the top GUI and the left GUI as well. Then we'll go inside of the frame, and now we have our text button. Let's go ahead and rename this, and we'll go ahead and call this reset. Then inside of here, we're going to go ahead and update the title. We'll actually go ahead and update the text to say something like reset, and then a space. And then in parentheses, we'll say a key code. So I'm going to go ahead and say R. And that'll indicate to the player that they can also press the R key in order to reset as well. And of course, since this is a text button, they can click the button as well if they want to reset that way. And also, we're going to set the reset button up for console as well, so that console players or controller players will be able to press a button on their controller and it'll reset for them as well. Anyways, another thing that we have to do is update the image of the icon image label. And the image that we want to go with for this is the cancel icon. Now, if you're unaware of where that cancel icon came from, I actually released a free icon pack on my website, MonzterDev. You guys can use it in all of your Roblox projects for completely free. If you want to get access to it, just visit the link down below in the description, MonzterDev. Anyways, now that we've updated that image, we're actually all finished with creating the GUI. Yeah, it was really simple and we really didn't need to do much because we did most of that work in the previous episode when we created the left screen GUI. With that being said, let's go ahead and collapse the right GUI and collapse the starters GUI in general. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is actually update the stages config. And we created that a few episodes ago, and that's inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and that is of course called stages. Now, inside of this module script, we actually want to go ahead and add another function to this. So we're going to say function, and this is going to be a shared function, so we'll add it to the shared table. And this function is going to be called getSpawnLocation. And it's going to have a single parameter, which would actually be a stage, and that would be a number. Now, when we use this function, we're going to pass through the stage that the player is currently on. And with that stage, what this function will do is it'll actually find the spawn location inside of our workspace for that specific stage. So to do this, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called stage folder. And to get the specific stage folder, what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the workspace, inside of the stages folder, and then we're going to index that with the specific stage. So now that we have the stage folder, let's go ahead and create a variable for the spawn location. And how are we going to get the spawn location? Well, we'll use the stage folder, and we should actually specify the type of this. So we'll go back to the stage folder variable and use a colon to indicate the type of this, which is a folder. Now that we specify that type, when we actually try to use a method on this variable, we can actually see suggestions given to us. And the method that we want to use is findFirstChildOfClass. Now, the difference between findFirstChildOfClass and findFirstChild is findFirstChild will look for an instance with a specific name, whereas findFirstChildOfClass will actually look for a specific type of instance. So the instance that we want to look for is actually a spawn location. Now, the reason that we're using findFirstChildOfClass here is because this function is actually going to be used on both the server and the client side. And findFirstChild is required because this will be used on the client side. And because we actually have streaming enabled, which Roblox now enables by default on all new experiences, we're unable to guarantee that all the spawn locations will actually exist inside of the player's workspace on the client because of that. So that's why we have to use a findFirstChild method. Otherwise, if we were to directly index this with spawn location, then this would be fine on the server side. But on the client side, this could result in an error and break this function. So that's why we have to use findFirstChildOfClass. But now there's still another thing that we need to do in order to accommodate for the streaming enabled on the client side. And what we need to do is we need to actually check if the spawn location was found or not. And if the spawn location was not found, then we want to go ahead and wait for that part to actually be replicated to the client. So to do this, we're going to say stage folder, then we'll use wait for child, and the child that we want to wait for is spawn location. And remember, wait for child is just looking for a specific name, as there is no wait for child of class. And luckily for us, we named all of our spawn location instances spawn location, so that's why we're able to use wait for child. So if we were unable to get the spawn location at first, then we go ahead and wait for it. And then finally, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and return the spawn location. Might have made a little bit of a mistake right there. We actually want to set the spawn location variable to the spawn location that we wait for inside of the stage folder. So now if we don't get the spawn location at first, then we'll wait for it, and then we will actually return a spawn location. And now that we've done that, we're actually completely finished with updating this module script, so we can go ahead and close out of it. Now, the next thing we're going to do takes place inside of the replicated storage, and that is adding in a brand new remote event. So inside of the remotes folder, I'm going to go ahead and add in a brand new remote event, and I'm going to rename this remote event to be called respawn. And we're going to go ahead and use this remote event anytime the player forcefully respawns themselves or resets themselves, in order to communicate that from the client over to the server so that the server is able to increase the player's deaths every single time they forcefully respawn. Now that we've added in this remote event, that's the last thing that we're going to do inside of the replicated storage, at least for now, so we can go ahead and collapse that. And now the next thing that we're going to do is actually go ahead and update the respawn service. So going inside of the server script service, inside of the services folder, we're going to go ahead and open up the respawn service module script. And now the first thing that we're going to do inside of this module script is go ahead and create a variable for the replicated storage. And now that we've created a variable for the replicated storage, we're going to go below where we require the player data service, and we're going to actually create a variable for the stages config that we just updated. So we'll go ahead and say require replicated storage.configs.stages. In addition to that, we also want to create a variable for the remotes folder as well. So we'll say replicated storage.remotes. Now that we've created all of those variables, let's go down to the respawn player function and modify this a little bit. Inside of here, we have a variable called spawn location. And currently the way that we get this is by going inside of the stages folder, getting the specific stage folder, and then getting the spawn location that way. Instead of doing this, let's go ahead and use the function that we just created so that we're keeping our code consistent. And because we're going to kind of use this on the client side as well, we want to keep all of that code in one space just in case we ever make any changes that we need to update it. Rather than updating it in both places, we only need to make that change in the module script where that function is created at. So to update this variable, what we're going to do is we're going to say stagesconfig.getSpawnLocation, and then we'll go ahead and pass through the stage that the player is on. And then with that being said, that's all that we're going to do to update this function. Now let's go to the onStart function. Inside of the onStart function, currently when a player's profile is loaded, we go ahead and respawn them. And then we also listen for whenever their character is added, and then we call respawn player once again. But now we're actually going to clear all of that out. And we're actually going to remove this function entirely. And all we're going to do is actually connect this directly to the shared.resetPlayer function. And the reason for that is because a lot of what we were handling there, we're actually going to instead handle on the client side. But we still need to call respawn player when the player's profile is loaded, because the respawn player function actually uses the request stream around async method. And what this will do is it'll actually forcefully load in the stages that the player was previously at when they first joined the game, in case those stages are out of the player's render range because of the streaming enabled. So that's why we're still calling respawn player when the player's profile is first loaded. Now, in addition to that, we actually can remove all of this code where we pretty much effectively do the same thing, but this time instead for the players who are currently in the game. And now we want to do one more thing inside of the onStart function here. And what we want to do is actually connect to the respawn remote event that we just created. So we're going to go ahead and say remotes.respawn.onServerEvent, connect. We'll create an anonymous function inside of here. And the only argument that we're going to accept here is actually going to be a player. And now inside of this function, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and update the player's state to add a death to it. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called action. And we'll set the specific type of that to the player data service.updateStateAction, and we'll go ahead and create a table. Then for the type of this, we're going to go ahead and use update deaths. And then for the amount, we want to go ahead and update the player's deaths by 1. Now that we've created that action, let's go ahead and update the player's data. So we'll go ahead and say player data service.updateState, and then pass through the player and pass through the action. Now that we've updated the player state, let's also go ahead and call the respawn player function as well, passing through the player. Now, like I said, we're going to be handling a lot of what we handled inside of here on the client side. So for the most part, this is probably unnecessary, but we're still going to do it just in case. And with that being said, we're all finished with updating this script, so we can go ahead and close out of this script as well and collapse the server script service. And now the next thing that we're going to do is actually go ahead and create the respawn controller. So we're going to go inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, inside of the controllers folder, and we'll go ahead and add in a brand new module script. We'll go ahead and rename this to be called respawn controller, and then we'll go ahead and update our module as we normally do. So we'll create the local table and the shared table, and then go ahead and return that shared table. Then inside of here, we want to go ahead and create a variable for the player service. In addition to the player service, we also want to get the replicated storage as well. Then we want to go ahead and create a variable for the local player. So we'll go ahead and say players.localPlayer. We also want to create a variable for the state controller. And to access the state controller, we of course say require script.parent.stateController. In addition to the state controller, we also want to create a variable for the stages config. And of course, we'll go ahead and require that from the replicated storage, the configs folder, and and of course that is called stages. Then finally, we want to create a variable for the remotes folder, which is inside of the replicated storage, just like that. Now that we've gotten all those variables created, the first thing that we're going to do is create a function. So we're going to say function, and this is going to be part of the local table, and it's going to be called set respawn location, and it's not going to have any parameters. The first thing we want to do inside of this function is get the player's current stage using the state controller. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called current stage, and we'll use the state controller, we'll use the get state function, and we'll go ahead and index that with the stage to get the specific stage that the player is currently on. Next, we want to go ahead and get the spawn location part from the specific stage. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called spawn location, and to get the spawn location, we can go ahead and use that function that we created inside of the stages config earlier. So we'll go ahead and say get spawn location. And what do we want to pass through here? We want to go ahead and pass through the current stage that the player is on. And now that we've gotten that spawn location, we're going to go ahead and set a property of the player object, which is called respawn location. And as we can see in the description, this property, if set, the player will respawn at the given spawn location. So we'll go ahead and set that property to the specific spawn location that we just received. And that's actually all that we're going to do inside of this function. Now that we've created that, let's go ahead and create the onStart function. So we'll go ahead and say onStart. And now when this script loads up, the first thing that we want to do is actually go ahead and set the player's respawn location. So we'll go ahead and call that function. We'll say local.set respawn location. Now let's consider another time when we would want to set the player's respawn location. Well, maybe you thought of it, maybe you didn't, but another time that we want to set the player's respawn location is actually when they advance to another stage. And we can do this using the state controller. So we'll go ahead and say state controller dot update state dot event. We'll connect to that, and we'll create an anonymous function inside of here. Of course, this function is going to accept the action, which is of the state controller dot update state action type. And now when the update state event has fired, what we're going to do is check if the type of the action is update stage. And if it is update stage, then let's go ahead and call the set respawn location function to update the player with the brand new spawn location. So now we fully set up setting the player's respawn location. The next thing that we're going to do is actually create another function, and this is actually going to be a shared function, which is going to be called respawn player. And this is going to accept a character, which is going to be of the model type. Now, with this function, what we actually want to do is teleport the player's character to the respawn location. And depending on how far you've gone into Roblox development, you might think there's a couple of different easier ways that we could have actually handled this, or this all could have been handled using the respawn location property of the player. The thing is though, is that with this function, we pretty much need to override Roblox's unintuitive respawn system. It doesn't work exactly as you'd think, and even really understanding how it works was very hard because it's not documented very specifically or exactly, so there's a couple of different things that were simpler that I've tried that just none ever actually panned out. And we'll go more in detail about that as we create this function. Anyway, the first thing that we want to do inside of this function is create a variable for the respawn location. So we'll go ahead and say respawn location, and to get the player's respawn location, what we'll do is index the player with the respawn location to get that property. Now, if the player does not have a respawn location, then we want to actually stop the function right there because there's nowhere to teleport the player to. After that, we'll create a variable called has teleported, and we're going to set that to false. The reason that we're creating that variable is because we're actually going to then create a while loop, and this is going to run while the player has not been teleported. So we're going to say while not has teleported do. And of course, anytime we create a while loop, we usually pretty much always want to include a task.wait inside of here, and we're going to go ahead and wait 0.01 seconds. So this is going to be repeating very quickly. Now, like I was saying before we even began creating this, you might think that respawning a player could be as simple as listening to when the player's character actually respawns and then using the pivot to method on the character model, which would effectively teleport the player's character to a specific position/location. The thing is though, is that because of how Roblox's respawn system works, that is not a valid solution. I've been there, I've tried that, but however Roblox has their system set up, for whatever possible reason it could be, there's a couple of different reasons. That's just really why I'm not listing every possibility off. It's not as simple as just using the pivot to method. Instead, what we're going to do is use a while loop. And now, the first thing we want to do inside of this while loop is we actually want to create a variable for the player's primary part. And we can get that by using the primary part property of the player's character. Now, this function is actually going to be called every single time the player's character is respawning. So as the player's character is respawning, there's kind of an edge case that we have to account for. And basically, we cannot actually guarantee that the player's character has been loaded in fully yet. It might sound a little bit weird, but yeah, that's just actually how it is. To make this a little bit easier to understand, let's go ahead and actually set up when we're going to call this function before we even finish it, because I think the added context will clear up any confusion. Going back to the onStart function, what we're going to do inside of here is when the script kind of loads up for the first time, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called character, which is going to be equal to player.character. Now, if the player's character exists, then what we want to do is actually go ahead and use the respawn player function. So we'll go ahead and pass through their character. But otherwise, if the player's character has not been loaded in yet, then what we're going to do is listen for the character added event on the player object. And we're going to go ahead and connect this directly to the shared.respawnPlayer function. So we're going to call the respawn player function when the script loads up for the first time, because the player just joins the game, so of course we want to respawn them in the spawn location that they should be at. And then also every single time the player's character added event is fired. So anytime the player's character dies or anything like that, we'll also respawn the player at where they should be. So now that we understand where this is called, getting back inside of the while loop, like I said with the primary part, because of when this is being called, it's actually not guaranteed that the player's character has been fully loaded in. So that's why we're creating a variable for the primary part, because then we want to check if the primary part even exists. So we're going to say if not primary part or not primary part dot position. So if either of those things don't exist, then what we're going to do is say task.wait 0.01, and then we'll go ahead and say continue. Now what continue does is rather than breaking this loop and stopping it inside of here, it's just going to restart the loop from up here. And then if this condition is no longer true, it'll directly skip over that because the player's character is expected to be loaded eventually. Then after we know that the player's primary part actually exists, we're now able to teleport the player's character to a specific location. So we'll go ahead and say character, we'll use the pivot to method, and where do we want to teleport the character to? Well, we will want to teleport them to the respawn location .cframe. And now we're actually teleporting the player over to that respawn location. And now we need to do something to make sure that the player's character has actually teleported over there and guarantee it. I believe that this little edge case comes up because how we're teleporting the player's character right here, there's a chance that Roblox's default respawn system will actually teleport them to the respawn location that Roblox thinks that they should be at after we've just teleported the player. So that's why we have to make sure that the player is still actually near the respawn location. So we're going to go ahead and actually create a variable called distance between, and now we want to get the distance between the player and the respawn location. So in parentheses, we're going to say primary part dot position, and then we're going to subtract from that the respawn location dot position. And then outside of these parentheses, we'll go ahead and say dot magnitude, which will give us the length of the vector 3. So now distance between will actually be a whole number, and that is the amount of studs between the primary part position and the respawn location position. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that the distance between is less than 1. And if it is, then we'll go ahead and set has teleported to true. And that will effectively end our loop right there because the player has been teleported to where they should have been. Now there's one more thing that we need to do inside of this function, and that's actually outside of the while loop. Once this while loop finishes and the player has been teleported and fully respawned, the last thing that we need to do is communicate from the client to the server that the player has actually respawned on the client side. So we'll go ahead and do this by saying remotes.respawn and then fire server. Just like that. And now that we fully finished creating that function, we've also already set up where we actually call it at. But just to recap that, when the script loads up for the first time and the player is initially joining the game, we check to make sure that their character actually exists, and then we try to respawn them. If their character doesn't exist though, we just listen to the character added event and then respawn them that way. And of course, the character added event will handle every single time the player's character respawns as well, which will effectively call the respawn player function as it should. And with that all being said, that's all that we're going to actually do inside of the respawn controller script, so we can go ahead and close out of that. And now we're going to go ahead and begin scripting the GUI. And to start this off, we'll first go inside of the GUI controller script and add the right GUI that we just created to the GUI's variable. So we'll go inside of the GUI's variable, and for the key, we'll go ahead and say write. Then we'll say player GUI, wait for child, and then we want to wait for the screen GUI, which is called write. And that's all that we're going to do inside of here, so we can go ahead and close out of this as well. And now we can go ahead and actually start scripting the reset button. So to do this, we'll go inside of the GUI's folder and we'll go ahead and duplicate the social module script. Then we'll rename one of these to be called reset, and then we'll go ahead and open it up. And inside of here, we're of course going to change a bunch of the different variables. First things first, we do want the player service, but instead of the social service, we actually want to create a variable for the user input service. We still want the player variable, we still want the GUI controller, but we also want to create a variable for the respawn controller as well. And to get that, we'll say require script.parent.parent.respawn controller, just like that. Then for the GUI variable, we're not accessing the left GUI, instead we're accessing the right screen GUI. And then for the button, we're not accessing the social button, instead we're accessing the reset button. Then we do not need any invite options, and we can go ahead and clear out all the functions inside of here. Then between the button and local variable, we're going to go ahead and create a constant variable, which is going to be called button_text. And we're going to set this equal to a string. And inside of the string, we're going to say reset, and then in parentheses, we're going to type in all capital letters replace. And you've seen us use this method before, but we're going to be using this constant because we're going to be updating the text of the title text label inside of the reset button to display the specific key code or button that the player can press in order to reset as well. So the replace text right here is going to be replaced with R for players who are playing on keyboard, and then for controller players, it'll be replaced with Y because the players can press the Y button in order to reset. Anyways, the first thing that we're going to do inside of here is go ahead and create a function, which is going to be part of the local table, and this is going to be called reset. And it's not going to have any parameters. This is going to be a very simple function, but what we want to do is create a variable for the player's character. So we'll go ahead and say player.character. And now if the player's character does exist, then what we want to do is use the respawn controller and use the respawn player function and pass through the player's character. And like I said, this was a really simple function, and that's actually all that we're going to do for this. Then we'll go above that and we'll go ahead and create our usual onStart function, just like that. And now the first thing that we're going to do is set up whenever a player clicks on the GUI button. So to do this, all we have to say is button.mousebutton1click :connect, and we'll go ahead and connect that directly to the reset function, just like that. So anytime the player clicks or taps on the GUI button on their screen, they will go ahead and reset. In addition to that though, we want to listen to when the player presses some keys. So if they're on keyboard, we'll listen for them to press the R key. And like I said, if they're on controller, then we'll listen for them to press the Y button. And when they do that, we want to go ahead and call the reset function as well. Now, how can we listen for player input? Well, we can actually use the user input service. And we want to actually listen to the input began event. So we'll go ahead and connect that to an anonymous function, with the parameters being the input as the input object and game processed event as a boolean. Now, game processed event just means that Roblox actually handled this, like maybe the player clicked on a GUI or something like that, or maybe the player is typing inside of a text box or different things like that, where Roblox will automatically handle those events. So depending on your circumstance, you probably will not want to also handle those events if they're already being handled, basically. So the first thing that we're going to do inside of here is say if game processed event, then return n, so that we stop the function right there. After that, we're going to create a variable called isResetButton. And what we're going to do is we're going to check if the key code of the input object is a specific key code. So we're going to check if the key code is actually button Y, and this key code is for controller players, which of course would be the Y button on the controller. Then what we'll do is highlight that text and then copy it by hitting Control-C. Then we'll say OR and paste that code in. And the second key code that we want to check is if the key code is R. So if the player presses the R key. Now that we've created that variable, we can then say if isResetButton, and if the player input one of those specific buttons, then we'll go ahead and call the reset function just like that. So now we've actually fully set up resetting, whether that be if the player actually clicks on the GUI button or if the player presses in a hotkey for resetting as well. Now, still inside of the onStart function, we want to do one more thing. And that last thing is updating the title text label of the button to display the specific hotkey that the player can press, depending on if they're using keyboard or controller. Now, what we need to do is determine if the player is playing on mouse and keyboard or the controller. And to do this, we're going to use the user input service once again, and we'll listen to the last input type changed event. We'll go ahead and connect that to an anonymous function, and we should be getting the last input type just like that. Then we'll create a variable inside of here called isMouseKeyboard. And what we're going to do is check if the input type is of a specific type, which would belong to either the mouse or the keyboard. So we'll say last input type equals, and we're going to check if the last input type equals the user input type dot mousebutton1. And then we'll say OR, and now we also want to check if the last input type equals user input type dot keyboard. So if the player uses the mouse or if they use their keyboard, then we know that the player is playing on mouse and keyboard. Then we'll create a variable called isGamepad. And here we'll check if the player is actually playing using a controller. And to do this, we'll check if the last input type is of the user input type dot gamepad1. So that's how we can tell if the player is playing on gamepad or if they're playing on mouse and keyboard. Then we'll go ahead and say if is mouse and keyboard, then. And now what we want to do is update the title text label inside of the button. So we'll go ahead and say button.title.text. And what do we want to set the text to? Well, we'll go ahead and use the button text variable that we created earlier. and we'll use the G sub method on it. And for the first argument, what do we want to replace? Well, we want to replace the word replace in all capital letters. And what are we going to replace that word with? Well, we would replace it with an R because the player is on mouse and keyboard. Then we'll say else if, and now if the player is on gamepad, then we'll pretty much do the same thing. So we'll go ahead and copy and paste this down here. And now instead of replacing it with the letter R, we'll go ahead and replace it with the letter Y so that the player knows to press the Y button on their controller. And now that's actually all that we have to do inside of here. And now last input type change will actually fire anytime the player uses a key on their keyboard or uses their mouse or even uses the controller. And we can easily see that when we actually get into the game. So now we've handled all of that inside of here, we're actually done with creating the script. So we can go ahead and close out of that. And we can also collapse the starter player because we're fully finished with scripting this. Now we are fully finished that, but there is actually one more thing that we need to do. And I kind of regret that we have to do this, but off screen, I made a slight change to the module loader that we actually have to update. So to do this, we have to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the libs folder, and open up the module loader module. Inside of here, we want to look inside of the require module function. And now, when we call the onStart function inside of this if statement, what we want to do is we want to wrap this in a task.spawn and put the onStart function directly inside of there. Basically, there were some weird issues that would come up with the state controller not fully loading. I'm not exactly sure the reason behind it, but I did a lot of testing and it seemed like task.spawn was a perfectly working solution and it didn't seem to cause any other issues. So that's why we have to update this here. Now, if you're watching this episode a little bit further in the future, this might have already been implemented for you because I did actually go back and update the starting file. But if you found this series on like day one and you've been following it since then you probably had to make this change. Anyways, with that being said, we're done with adjusting the module loader, so we can go ahead and close out of that, collapse the replicated storage, and actually go into our game and test this out. So once we load into our game, we should see our top bar is still working fine. We also have our social button. Let's go click the social button. We can see that that's working all good. We can see that we were actually respawned on the 10th stage, so that's looking good. We can see the reset button right here, and we can see it displays reset and the R key. Let's actually move a little bit and then click the reset button, and when we click that, we can actually see that we're respawned right at the spawn location, and we can also see our deaths are being increased as well. Now I'm going to hit the R key on my keyboard, and I can see that I'm respawned as well. And now I actually have a controller plugged in, and when I swap to my controller, you can actually see the button is updated to display the Y button. So now I'm going to go ahead and press the Y button, and we can see that I'm respawned again, just like that. So that's actually all seems to be working perfectly. Now I can directly swap back over to my mouse and keyboard, and as soon as I press my mouse, we can see that it's updated to R, and if I move my controller again, we can see it goes back to Y. So that's staying completely in sync and updating perfectly as it should be. Now, while this is looking pretty perfect, I think we can see one little issue here, and it seems like we're being teleported back to this like spawn location twice every single time we reset or respawn. And there's actually a pretty easy way for us to fix this. In order to fix this, we're going to go inside of the server script service, inside of the services folder, and update the respawn service that we created earlier. The reason that this is happening is because on the client, when we respawn the player, we go ahead and teleport them to the respawn location that they should be at. But we also fire off to the server the respawn remote event, and on the server, when we connect to it, what we actually do is we call the respawn player function inside of here as well. And if we look at the respawn player function, this function also teleports the player to that spawn location as well. Now, we kind of need this because of the request stream around async function, like I was saying earlier, because of streaming enabled. But to prevent the player from being teleported twice, what we can do is actually go inside of the character if statement and then check if the player's character is actually already at the spawn location. Now, to begin doing this, we actually first want to start before the if statement because we want to create a variable for the primary part of the character. So we'll say character.primaryPart. Then we can use this if statement and we can check if the character and its primary part actually exists. Then inside of the if statement, we'll go ahead and create a variable called distance between. And of course, we'll go ahead and check the distance between the primary parts position, and then we'll subtract the spawn location's position from it, and then we'll go ahead and use magnitude on those parentheses. And now, if the distance between is less than 25, then what we'll actually do is stop the function right there, so we'll go ahead and say return. You might be thinking that 25 studs away from the spawn location is a lot, but the thing is that 25 studs is actually a lot less far away than you actually realize. And also, we want to give laggy players a little bit of leeway as well. And what I mean by that is on the client side, when the player's character respawns, that's completely instant. After that, they fire off a remote event, and depending on how good or bad the player's network might be, that remote event might not get delivered to the server until, even at worst times, a couple seconds later. And if it's that bad, then when that event is actually called and this function is fired, the distance between the player's character and the spawn location are going to be gigantic, so the player's character will be teleported back to the spawn location for a second time, maybe like half a second later or a couple seconds later. It all depends depends on how good or bad their connection is. Now, realistically, I think if the distance between is even at 100, so as long as they're within 100 studs of each other, that should be fine, because at this distance, the player should still have the spawn location actually loaded in and replicated to them, and the client should be able to handle that themselves, so we shouldn't have to call pivot 2 if the distance is even that large. Turns out we made another mistake. I gotta give a huge shout out to some of my testers who actually spotted and found this mistake, because without the testers, then we would not be able to guarantee that these episodes would be bug-free. So a huge thank you to all of them. Now, you're probably wondering what this mistake is. When I start my game up, we can see that I have 224 deaths. Then I'm going to stop the game and start it once again. This time, once we load into the game, I actually have 225 deaths. So what's going on here is the player is gaining an additional death every single time they join the game. Luckily for us though, it doesn't take too much to actually fix this. So what we first want to do is update the respawn controller. We'll go ahead and open that up. So what actually causes this is actually inside of the onStart function. When our script loads up for the first time, we try to get the character, and if we do get the character, then we go ahead and call respawn player. And we also call it every single time the player's character is added as well. And of course, if the player's character is not loaded yet, then this will not run, but we account for that here because then of course the character added event will be fired off at some point. So if you look inside of the respawn player function and we go all the way down, we do fire off the respawn remote event as the last thing. So considering we're firing off the respawn remote event as soon as the player is loaded into our game, that is what's causing them to get a death as soon as they join. Now of course there are tons of different ways that you could actually solve this issue, but the one that I'm going to go with is updating the respawn player function. We're going to add a second parameter here, which is going to be called isDeath, and that is going to be a boolean, and it's going to be optional, so we'll go ahead and include a question mark there. And how we're actually going to use the isDeath parameter is with the remote event. So what we want to do is we want to check is if death is true, and if it is true, then what we're going to do is go ahead and fire off that remote event like we normally would. Now that we've updated this function, we have to update some places where we call this as well. So let's go back to the top of our script, and inside of the onStart function, we're going to modify this a little bit as well. To make this solution as simple as possible, what we're going to do is we're actually going to first update the character variable. As of right now, when the script loads up, we try to access the player's character, but it might not actually exist at this time. And if it doesn't exist, then the character added event will pick it up because that event will be fired if the character has not already been loaded yet. And of course, it'll also be fired every other time that their character respawns and things like that as well. But we're going to change this a tiny bit. So where we create the character variable, we're going to say or. And now if the character does not exist, what we're then going to do is actually wait for the character to be added. And we can do this by saying player.character added. So this is actually the exact same event that we're using down here, but rather than using the connect method, we're actually going to use the wait method. And the wait method will actually stall this script until the character has been added, and it'll also return to us the character model as well. So this will effectively guarantee that we do actually get the character before we even start listening to the character added event. So then once we get the character, we'll go ahead and respawn the player, and we're not going to even include a second argument here because we don't want this to count as a death. But now going down to where we actually listen to the character added event, we want to update this so that the deaths are counted here. So to do this, we're going to go ahead and remove where we connect the function like we did, and instead we'll go ahead and create an anonymous function inside of here. And now we'll go ahead and call the respawn player function, passing through the character, and we'll also pass through true because every time the player's character has been added, that effectively means that their character has been respawned, so we do want that to count as a death. And now that's all that we have to do inside of here, so we can go ahead and exit out of that script. But since we did update the respawn player function, we also have to update our reset module that we created as well to accommodate for that. So inside of the GUIs folder, we have the reset module, and if we scroll down and look at the reset function, we can see this is where we call the respawn player function. And because every single time the player resets by clicking the button or using a hotkey, we of course want that to actually count as a death, so we'll go ahead and pass through true to here as well. And that's all that we have to do inside of this script, so we can go ahead and close out of that. And now there's actually one more change that we need to make, and that is actually on the server side. So inside of the server script service, inside of the services folder, we want to actually update the effects service. And what we want to specifically update is the use effect function. The reason for this is because inside of here, we actually go ahead and create a death action. And if we look at the logic for how we handle the effects, if the player touches a part with a kill effect, what we do is we load their character. And when we use the load character method on the player, that will cause the character added event to be fired off. And whenever that event is fired off on the client side, we go ahead and respawn the player, and then we use the reset remote event to communicate to the server to give them a death. So because of this, we do not also need to add a death here as well, so we can go ahead and actually remove this line where we increase the player's death. Then if we look at the damage effect, we can see right here where we actually reduce the player's health. But now we have to consider how Roblox's humanoid actually functions. And it turns out that when the humanoid's health goes down to 0 or below, the player's character will actually respawn as well, which will again trigger off that character added event. So that means that we do not need to add the player's death here as well, so we can actually remove all of that too. And since we've removed all of that, we can also go ahead and remove out the death action variable that we created here as well, because we're not actually using that at all. And now that we've done that, we can go ahead, exit out of the script, and finally test this out. So we can see that once I load into the game, I have 225 deaths. Now let's go ahead, fall off, and when I fall off and respawn, I have 226. When I use the GUI, I have 227. When I reset my character by using Roblox's default reset system, I go up to 228. If I touch a kill part, I also go up to 229. And then if I go over to a damage part and die to this, let's see if I go up to 230 just to make sure. So now I've died to that, and now we have seen that I actually did go up to 230, so all of that seems to be working perfectly. Now I do apologize for not doing everything correctly the first time, and also choosing to not re-record those parts of the episode. I really don't like making these after edits where I actually have to go back in, change up some code, and do everything else like that. I much prefer to make it correct the first time, but I felt like this wouldn't take too much time to actually solve, so hopefully it wasn't too much of an inconvenience to you guys. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with all that being said, that's going to be it for this episode. If you did enjoy, go down below, hit the like button, leave a comment if it did work for you. I really appreciate it. And if you want to support me, gain access to all the scripts and the game file that we made today, as well as a ton of other resources that you can use to easily make your next Roblox game, there's a link down below in the description to MonzterDev, which is my website, or Patreon, which you can support me on both and get access to all those resources on. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope that you have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.